Second Earth. Courtney finished Bobby's second amazing journal and placed it down on the table. Mark had finished a few minutes earlier and was already looking over the additional piece of parchment paper that Bobby had included with his latest missive. It took a while for her to say anything. The story contained on the pages from Bobby was getting more fantastic with each new paragraph, and she had to let it sink in. Finally, she looked at Mark and asked, "What does he want you to do?" Mark stood up and paced Courtney's dad's workshop as his mind tried to work its way around the task at hand. On the additional piece of parchment, Bobby had outlined a job for Mark to do that was fairly simple, yet still dangerous. "It's a list," explained Mark. "He wants me to put together a bunch of stuff and get it to him." Courtney grabbed the paper and looked over the list. "Get it to him," she exclaimed. "How?" Mark grabbed the list back and shook it at her. That's the hard part," he declared nervously. "He wrote out instructions. First, I'm supposed to try and use the ring the way Osa did, but if that doesn't work, which it shouldn't because I'm not a traveler, then he wants me to find the gate to the flume in the subway station." "You mean the abandoned subway in the Bronx with the killer dogs?" asked Courtney in disbelief. "That's like suicide." "Yeah, tell me about it," Mark exclaimed. Courtney and Mark fell silent. It was a dangerous favor that Bobby was asking. Finally, Courtney asked, "But you're going to do it, right?" "Of course," Mark answered quickly, as if he were insulted that she even had to ask. "You think I'd blow off my best friend? Give me a break." "Then I'm going with you," said Courtney without a hint of doubt. "No way," Mark said quickly. "Yeah way," Courtney shot back. "You need somebody to cover your butt." "Who will cover your butt?" "I can cover my own butt," said Courtney with her usual cockiness. It was hard to argue with that. Courtney could cover her own butt, but Mark doubted that she ever had to do it in a place like the Badlands of the South Bronx against a pack of vicious quig dogs and a demon killer by the name of St. Dane. No, he was pretty sure Courtney hadn't encountered that particular challenge before. But then again, he didn't want to do this alone. The idea terrified him. He thought over the dilemma for a good 5 seconds and then asked, "You sure you want to help?" "Absolutely," she said as she grabbed Bobby's list back. She looked it over and then announced, "I get why he wants some of this stuff, a flashlight, a watch, but what's he going to do with a CD player?" "You're asking me like I should know," Mark said sarcastically. "None of this makes any sense to me." Courtney scanned the list again and then said, "Uh-oh, he wants some stuff from his house." "Yeah, I saw that," said Mark, "but I can substitute other things." This raised another tough issue. Courtney threw a sober stare at Mark and said, "If we can get things to Bobby, that means we can tell him his family disappeared." Mark had to think about this. Courtney's instincts were right. Bobby had to know what was going on, even though they didn't really know themselves. The only thing they knew for certain was that the Pendragons had vanished. "Bobby should know," said Mark cautiously while still working on his thoughts. "But not yet. There's nothing he can do about it now." "But it's his family," countered Courtney. "I know," said Mark, "but so is Uncle Press. I don't know what Bobby's got planned, but he has a shot at saving his uncle. I'm not sure there's anything he could do here to help his family." Courtney realized that Mark was right. Bobby needed to do what he had to do on Dendron. There would be plenty of time after that to find his family. Besides, the police were already working on the case. What more could Bobby do? "We'll tell him after he's back for good," said Mark with finality. "And what if he doesn't come back for good?" asked Courtney. "Mark, I think we should tell our parents what's going on." "No, no, no, we can't," shouted Mark. "Why? Maybe they can help," said Courtney hopefully. "It would be much safer if we all went to the subway with the stuff, right?" Mark really wanted to agree. He wanted to dump this all on an adult who had more authority than he had, but he felt certain he knew what would happen if they did. He chose his words carefully and said, "Courtney, I'd love to tell our parents and get their help and go to the subway station with Captain Hirsch and armed cops from the Stony Brook police. But you know what would happen if we told them? They'd stop us. They'd probably lock us up. Then they'd all sit around and try to logically figure out what's going on, and by the time they came to any decisions, it could be too late for Bobby and for Press." Courtney let Mark's words sink in. The guy was kind of a dweeb, but he was a smart dweeb. If they told their parents, it would all be over. They had to do this on their own. Mark quickly gathered up the parchment papers and started rolling them up. "We can get this stuff together in a couple of hours," he said. "The trick will be to sneak out without our parents knowing." "Whoa, whoa," interrupted Courtney. "You're not thinking of doing this tonight, are you?" "Well, why not?" said Mark innocently. Courtney spoke to Mark slowly and deliberately, as if he were a child. She wanted him to understand exactly what she was saying. "This is important," she said, "but by the time we get this stuff together, it'll be dark, and something tells me that going where we have to go isn't too safe after dark." This made Mark think. They were headed into a rough part of town, and rough parts of town got rougher after dark. They definitely had a better chance of pulling this off in the daylight. It was more important to get it done than to get it done fast. You're right, said Mark. I'm not thinking straight. Yeah, you are, said Courtney. You're just excited. Let's split the list, get the stuff, and then meet back here tomorrow morning. That made sense. Tomorrow would be the day. Courtney searched for a piece of paper and a pen so she could write her own list. She picked up the piece of parchment paper with Bobby's instructions and looked at the yellowed paper with the blotchy writing for a long time. Mark could see that something else was on her mind. He waited for her to pull her thoughts together. Finally, Courtney turned to Mark and asked, "What was she like?" "What was who like?" asked Mark. "Osa. She gave you the ring, right? What was she like?" It was true. Mark had almost forgotten. He had actually met one of the characters from Bobby's adventure. She was in his bedroom. Mark put the rolled parchment papers down and allowed his thoughts to drift back to the night before. "She was like a dream," he said softly. "But the thing I remember most is that when she looked at me, I felt safe." Mark looked down to the ring on his finger and continued, "And now she's dead. I guess she wasn't able to make things safe after all." The two took a moment to grieve silently for a woman they only knew through the pages of Bobby's journal. Then Courtney picked up her pen and began to write. There was work to be done. They went over Bobby's list and picked up the items they felt they could each find most easily. Courtney made out the two lists. Then, with the plan of meeting back at her house at 7 a.m. the next day, they split up and went to work. Mark went home and brought Bobby's parchment papers with him. Bobby had asked him to treat them like gold, and that's what he planned to do. Mark had a hiding place that no one in his family knew about. His attic was full of old furniture. Tucked way in the back was an ancient roll-top desk that hadn't been moved since Mark was born. The drawers of the desk were locked, and his parents never tried to open them because they didn't have the key. But Mark did. He had found it hidden on a lip under the desk when he was 8 years old. He never told his parents because they didn't really care, but for him it was the perfect place to hide his most treasured possessions. His special stash included mint-condition Mad magazines, baseball cards for rookie Yankees Derek Jeter, Bernie Williams, and Mariano Rivera, some Star Wars action figures that were still in their original packaging, a report card from the 7th grade that had 2 Ds, just to remind him how easy it was to screw up, and an assortment of other small items that had special value to him alone. Every so often, Mark would go up to the attic to look over these treasures. It always made him feel good, like visiting old friends. He especially liked to check out the toys. He was too old to be playing with them, but they always brought him back to a fun time in his life. If only for a moment, it was a pleasure that no one had to know about. When he opened the drawer this time, he wasn't hit with the familiar warm wave of nostalgia. As he looked down at his good junk, he had the strange feeling that it belonged to someone else. And in a way, it did. It belonged to the old Mark, the innocent Mark of yesterday, whose biggest concerns were about finishing homework on time and battling the acne that was running wild on his nose. But that was yesterday. Today he had to deal with issues that not only affected life and death on the far side of the universe, but raised serious questions about the reality of his life in his own backyard. It wasn't until Mark opened that drawer that he realized how much he had changed in the past few hours. He wanted to pick up the Chewbacca figure and let out a chewy roar. He wanted to flip open a Mad magazine and laugh at Spy vs. Spy. He wanted to walk the dog with the whistling yo-yo he had kept since his day at the state fair when he was 6. Instead, he found a cardboard box, pulled out the drawer, and dumped everything into it. He closed the box and shoved it under the desk alongside all the other dusty, long-forgotten boxes full of long-forgotten stuff. It was like putting aside his old life to make room for the new one. This desk drawer was still going to be the place for Mark's most valued possessions, but they were no longer the trinkets that held warm memories of childhood. This would now be the place to hold Bobby's story. He carefully placed the rolled scrolls in the wooden drawer. They fit perfectly, front to back. Mark made a mental note that there would be room for many more scrolls. He usually kept the desk key in his bedroom desk, but that didn't feel secure enough anymore. His mother had given him a silver chain that she used to wear when she was his age. It had a peace symbol on it, and Mark had it hanging from his bedroom mirror. Mark took the chain down and replaced the pendant with the key. The chain went around his neck, never to be away from him again. He now felt reasonably secure that Bobby's pages were safe, or at least as safe as he knew how to keep them. At 7 a.m. sharp, Courtney's doorbell rang. When she opened the door, Mark was standing there wearing a large backpack from L.L. Bean. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "No," she answered. "Did you get any more pages?" "No," he answered. "Let's get this party started." They went down to Courtney's dad's workshop, where Courtney had laid out all of the items from her half of the list. "Where are your parents?" Mark asked her. "They left for work." "You know, we have to cut school to do this," Mark said. "Do you care?" asked Courtney. Mark didn't have to answer. The two stood there looking at items, not sure of what to do next. Courtney broke the tension. "Try the ring thing," she said. Mark scanned the items and picked out the flashlight. It was roughly the same size as the rolled parchment pages, and as good as a candidate as any. He then took off the ring and put it on the floor. He knelt down, put his finger on the gray stone, and looked at Courtney. "Go for it," she encouraged. "Denderon," whispered Mark. Nothing happened. "Denderon," he said again, this time a bit louder. Still no reaction from the ring. "Let me try," said Courtney, and knelt down. She touched the ring and shouted, "Denderon." They both looked at the ring, but it lay motionless on the ground. "I guess we're going to the subway," Mark said soberly. Courtney jumped up and started to pack the gear into Mark's backpack. She moved fast, as if she were afraid she might chicken out if she stopped to think too much about what lay ahead. "I got a train schedule," she said efficiently. "We can take the commuter train to 125th Street, then catch a subway from there." When she finished packing, she closed up the buckles on the pack and looked at Mark. It was time to go. "Courtney," said Mark sheepishly, "I'm scared." The two let that admission hang in the air for a moment. Then Courtney straightened up and said, "You know something? I'm not. We're going to do this." It may have been a bold bluff, but seeing Courtney being her usual confident self gave Mark hope. Maybe they could do this. So he hoisted the pack onto his back, and the two started for the train station. Stony Brook Station was at the bottom of the Ave. It was early, so the platform was still packed with business commuters in suits who were on their way to New York City. Courtney and Mark had to keep one eye out for any parents who might know them and question why they weren't in school. They saw one guy who Mark knew from Boy Scouts, but they saw him in time to make sure they boarded a different car when the train pulled into the station. They didn't need to be so cautious. All the commuters had their heads buried in their newspapers and didn't look at anyone else on the platform. The train ride into New York was a quiet one. The commuters who weren't waiting were asleep. It would have been hard for Courtney and Mark to discuss their mission, for they definitely would have been overheard. Mark looked at the commuters reading their morning papers and had to laugh to himself. They were all reading articles about the stock market, or about sports, or about a speech the president had given at some parade. But whatever news they were reading couldn't compare to the very real story that he and Courtney were living out right in front of their noses. Mark could imagine the headline, "Local boy flumed across the universe to lead revolution." Now that's a news story. All Courtney wanted to do was take these few minutes to relax. She knew that once they stepped off this train, their adventure would begin, and she wanted to be calm enough to handle whatever came their way. So she laid back in her seat, closed her eyes, and tried to keep her heart from beating as fast as it was. In no time, they arrived at their stop, 125th Street in Manhattan. The train would continue on from there to Grand Central Station, where most of the commuters were headed. But 125th Street was much closer to the Bronx, so with a silent nod, Courtney and Mark got off the train. They had always heard their parents say that this was a bad section of town. They weren't entirely sure what was meant by bad, but they were nervous just the same. One thing was certain, this wasn't suburban Connecticut. They were in New York City with all the traffic, noise, and people congestion that New York is famous for. Courtney had a map of the New York City subways and had carefully plotted out a route to get close to Bobby's abandoned subway station. It was a short walk from the 125th Street commuter trains to the nearby subway stop, and they made it with no problem. They descended into the underground station, bought their tokens, and hit the trains. The subway trip to the Bronx was uneventful. The neighborhoods of New York that they had traveled through were filled with people from all different nationalities and ethnic backgrounds, and none of them were monsters. They were all just people going to work or going to school and generally living their lives. Under other circumstances, Courtney and Mark might have enjoyed this, but these weren't other circumstances. They were on a mission. After changing trains twice, they arrived at the subway stop that was nearest to the abandoned one that Bobby had described. They climbed back up into the sunlight to see a Bronx neighborhood that was just as busy and diverse as the one where they had first gone underground. According to their map, Bobby's subway stop was 3 blocks east from where they were. As they walked those few blocks, neither of them said it, but each secretly wished that the subway station where Bobby and Uncle Press had gone wouldn't be there. They each held a slim hope that none of this was true and that Bobby was making the whole thing up. Those hopes totally disappeared when they reached the corner of a busy intersection and looked across to the far side. "That's it, isn't it?" asked Mark nervously. Courtney didn't have to answer. The station was exactly what Bobby had described. It was a small kiosk covered with cracked green paint. Mark gave a nervous look to Courtney, but Courtney kept her eyes on the building. She didn't want Mark to see that she was starting to get nervous. Instead, she stepped off the curb and headed for the building. Mark had no choice but to follow. When they got to the kiosk, they looked down to see a cement stairway that was covered in garbage and debris. This was definitely an abandoned station. After a quick glance around to make sure nobody was watching, They ran down the steps. They hit a landing, turned, and were faced with the boarded-up entrance that Bobby had described. Courtney reached out, grabbed hold of one board, and pulled it aside as easily as Uncle Press had done. She had just opened up a dark doorway into the underground. Before they had the chance to change their minds, Courtney ducked in and disappeared. Mark took a scared breath and was right after her. He had to squeeze through with the pack, but he made it and closed the board up behind him. Everything was playing out exactly as it had for Bobby, but Courtney and Mark were now hoping this is where the similarity would end. Neither of them wanted to run into St. Dane or the Quiggs. They walked down the last few steps into the abandoned station and stood shoulder to shoulder, with every sense on full alert. I feel like I've already been here, Mark said in awe. Indeed, everything was just as Bobby had described. It was a lonely station that hadn't seen passengers in years. Then they heard the distant rumble of an oncoming subway train. In a few seconds, the train blasted into the station and thundered through without slowing down. This seemed to kick them back into gear. Come on, said Courtney, and headed for the far end of the platform. Wait, said Mark, and quickly took off the pack. He opened it up and dug down deep inside. What are you doing? Asked Courtney. As he dug through the pack, Mark said, I brought a little insurance. He found what he was looking for and pulled out a package wrapped in brown paper. Was that on the list? Asked Courtney curiously. No, it's a little something I added. He unwrapped the paper to reveal two huge, succulent steaks. He held them up proudly. A bribe, just in case we run into some hungry Quiggs. Courtney had to smile. I don't care what anybody says. You're good. She then grabbed the steaks and walked off. Mark smiled proudly at the compliment, but then the smile dropped when he realized it wasn't exactly the greatest compliment in the world. He picked up the pack and hurried after her. They reached the end of the platform and saw the small set of stairs leading down to the dark tracks. This looks hairy, declared Mark. What if the gate door isn't there? Everything he described so far has been true, said Courtney. I gotta believe this will be too. Just then they heard another train approaching. They took a few steps back from the edge of the platform, and a few seconds later the train flashed through, moving fast. The idea of being down on those tracks when a train came through was a frightening one. Gulp, said Mark. Don't think, move, shouted Courtney. She ran to the edge of the platform and disappeared down onto the tracks. It was kind of like jumping into cold ocean water. The longer you thought about it, the more reasons you'd come up with to wait. It was better just to do it, and that's what she did. Mark was right behind her. He ran across the platform and hurried down the stairs to find Courtney below, pressing her back against the wall. I can't believe I did that, she said, panting hard. Yeah, me neither. But don't stop now, he added. With Courtney in the lead, the two made their way cautiously along the tunnel. It was dark and they didn't want to risk wandering out onto the tracks, so Courtney kept one hand on the grimy, greasy wall. How far did he say the door was? Asked Courtney. I don't remember, was Mark's answer. Just keep... That's when he heard it. What was that? He asked. What was what? I heard something, like a growl. Mark grabbed one of the steaks back from Courtney and held it out. Good doggy! Good doggy! Then Courtney heard it too. It was faint, but unmistakable. That's not a growl, she said. That's a train. Another train is coming. A blast from the train's horn told them she was right. Another train was coming, and the two were caught. They didn't know which way to run. I'm going back, shouted Mark, and turned to run back for the platform, but Courtney grabbed him by the pack and held him tight. No, we can't be far. She turned and continued to make her way along the wall as Mark pushed her from behind. It was getting hard to see because the train had just rounded a curve ahead, and its headlight was shining right in their eyes, and it was coming fast. Hurry, pleaded Mark. Courtney desperately felt at the wall, then tripped over a switch and fell to her knees. Mark quickly pulled her to her feet and pushed her forward. The train was now getting dangerously close. The racket from the wheels on the track was deafening. There wasn't much space between the wall of the tunnel and the track. We're not going to make it, Courtney shouted. Press against the wall. Mark pulled off his pack and flattened his back against the wall. The train was only a few yards away. The two held hands tightly. Mark closed his eyes. Courtney pressed against the wall and slid her hand out in one last desperate attempt to find the door. She leaned forward a few more inches, and her hand found something. I got it, she shouted. The train was right there, its horn blasted. Courtney held on tight to Mark's hand and dove for what she hoped was the gate. She pushed against the dark recess, and it gave way. Courtney and Mark tumbled inside just as the train flashed by. In seconds, it was gone, and all was quiet, as it had been only a few moments before. Courtney and Mark lay on the ground, totally out of breath. It took a minute for them to get their heads back together, and when they did, they both looked up and saw it at the same time. Whoa, was all Mark could say in awe. It was the rocky gray tunnel. With their eyes fixed on the craggy portal, they both stood up. Courtney then hurried back to the wooden door they had just come through and poked her head outside. It's here, she announced. The star, just like Bobby said. She came back inside to join Mark, who kept staring into the tunnel. This is it, he said with growing excitement. It's all true. Everything Bobby wrote is true. This was as far as Bobby's instructions took them. In his letter, he wrote for them to come to the gate and wait. But wait for what? They stood there for a few minutes, not exactly sure of what to do next. Finally, Courtney looked at Mark with a mischievous smile and said, I'm going to try it. She took a step toward the mouth of the gray tunnel, but Mark pulled her back. Don't, he yelled nervously. Why not? If Bobby can do it, I can do it, was her typical Courtney-esque response. She shook Mark off and stepped into the mouth of the flume. Mark backed away and watched nervously as Courtney faced the depths of the endless dark tunnel. She stood up straight, gave a quick glance to Mark, and turned back toward the darkness and said, Denderon. Nothing happened. Zero. They could hear the word echo back from the tunnel. But besides that, nothing. It's got to be the same as the ring, said Mark. If you're not a traveler, you don't have the power. Courtney backed out of the tunnel with a look of definite disappointment. She was psyched to take the magic carpet ride of light that Bobby had described, but it was not meant to be. So why is it that Bobby has the power? She asked, a little bit peeved. What makes him so special that... Shh! Mark held up his hand to quiet Courtney. What? Asked Courtney. Do you hear that? Courtney listened and then said, It must be another train coming. No, said Mark as he strained to listen harder. It's not a train. It sounds like music. Courtney listened harder, and soon she heard it too. It was music, far off music, but it wasn't a tune. It was more like a jumble of sweet high notes. I've heard that before, exclaimed Mark. When the ring opens up. He glanced down at the ring on his finger, but the gray stone wasn't glowing. No, this music wasn't coming from the ring. Courtney looked into the tunnel, and what she saw made her jaw drop open in surprise. Mark, she said numbly, you looking at this? Mark was also looking down the tunnel, and what he saw made his jaw fall open as well. For there was something coming toward them. It was a pin spot of light, like the headlight on the front of a far-off train. As it drew closer, the light grew larger, and the sweet music grew louder. Do we run? Asked Mark with a shaky voice. Yeah, answered Courtney, but we can't. As the light came nearer, they saw that the gray walls of the tunnel were beginning to change. It was like they were disappearing. The gray, craggy rock walls were transforming into clear crystal, just as the gray stone of the ring had done. Beyond the clear walls was a vast star field. The light grew so bright that Mark and Courtney had to shield their eyes. The music grew louder as well. Without thinking, the two backed away until they hit the far wall. They were trapped. It was too late to find the door and get out of there. All they could do was cover their eyes, crouch down, and hope that it would soon end. With one final burst of light, the room fell dark and the music stopped. All was quiet and calm. Slowly, Mark and Courtney lowered their arms from their faces to see what had happened. What they saw seemed more impossible than anything they had seen so far. Yet there he was, plain as can be. It was Bobby. He stood at the mouth of the tunnel, looking a little dazed. He glanced around to get his bearings, then saw Mark and Courtney cowering against the far wall. Nobody knew what to say. They all just stared at each other for a good long time. Finally, Bobby let out a simple, calm, "Yo." That broke the ice. Mark and Courtney jumped up, ran to him, and all three threw themselves into a tight group hug. They didn't need to say anything. This one unplanned action said it all. It was a release from all the fear, uncertainty, and sadness that had been building up in them since the adventure began. They stayed this way for some time until Bobby finally said, "Okay, I'm choking here." Reluctantly, they all let go, took a step back from each other. They waited a second, then all three ran at each other again for another hug. This time they all started to laugh. "You guys are the best," said Bobby. But then something dawned on him, and he pulled away from the group. He looked right at Courtney and said, "Wait, what are you doing here?" "I showed her the journals," admitted Mark. "I'm sorry, I couldn't deal on my own." Bobby had to think about this. He thought that he was writing to Mark and Mark alone, but it was a big responsibility that he threw at his friend, and Bobby realized that maybe sharing it was a good idea. If there was anybody who could help him deal, it was Courtney. So he smiled reassuringly at his friend and said, "It's cool, Mark. I'm glad you did. Does anybody else know?" Courtney answered, "No, just us." "That's good," said Bobby. "At first I was thinking everybody should know, but now I'm not so sure. This is all pretty heavy." "That's what we thought," said Mark. Bobby added, "There's going to be a time when everybody should know, but not yet, okay?" Courtney and Mark nodded. They were all on the same page. "Are my parents freaking out?" Bobby asked. There it was, the question they didn't want to answer. Mark and Courtney gave each other a quick glance. They had already decided it wouldn't be a good idea to tell Bobby that his family had disappeared. He had enough to worry about as it was, but they didn't want to lie to him. Mark didn't know what to say, so Courtney jumped in saying, "Everybody's real worried about you." It wasn't a lie. People were definitely worried about him. It just wasn't the whole truth. But it was the right thing to say because Bobby then said, I hate to keep them in the dark, but I think they'd be more worried if they knew what was really going down. So don't tell them anything, okay? Both Courtney and Mark nodded quickly. Phew, they just dodged a bullet. Bobby then spotted the LL Bean pack that Mark and Courtney brought. Did you get everything? He asked as he quickly poked through the contents. Every bit, answered Mark. Any trouble getting here? Bobby asked. Courtney answered, no sweat. Bobby looked back to his friends as if he were seeing them for the first time. What he saw were two people who came through for him in a big way when they really didn't have to. I don't know how to thank you guys, he said sincerely. I don't deserve friends like you. Courtney and Mark answered with smiles. Bobby, said Mark sheepishly, is it true? I mean, what you've been writing about? Yeah, was Bobby's answer. Weird, huh? Courtney and Mark started to ask more questions, but Bobby cut them off saying, guys, I don't know any more about what's going on than what I wrote. I don't know why I'm a traveler. I don't know where Denderon is. I don't know when Denderon is. I've got a million questions and no answers, and I'm scared as hell. Yes, there were many questions, but none of them had any answers. Finally, Courtney took a step toward Bobby. She hesitated, as if what she was about to say would be difficult. She finally gathered the strength and said, don't go back. That's not your world back there. It's not your life. You belong here. All you have to do is walk out that door with us. Nobody would know. Please, Bobby, stay here. Bobby looked at Mark. Mark nodded to him as if agreeing with Courtney. You're home now, Bobby, he said. Stay here. Bobby hadn't thought about the possibility. It would be so easy. All he had to do was walk away. He was home now. He was safe. It was so tempting. He didn't answer at first because this was the most important decision he ever had to make in his life. He looked around him, looked down into the dark tunnel, and then to the LL Bean pack full of stuff his friends had brought him. He had made up his mind. There are a ton of things I don't know, he said soberly. But there's one thing I do know for certain. Uncle Press is going to die unless I do something. The others dropped their heads. Bobby was right. If he stayed, Uncle Press was doomed. But there's more, Bobby added. I'm not the guy to help those people fight their revolution. I don't know why they think I am, but I'm not. The guy to help them is Uncle Press. If he dies, they don't stand a chance. I gotta go back and get Uncle Press for the sake of the Malago, too. Bobby picked up the pack and swung it onto his back. What are you going to do with that stuff? Asked Mark. I'm not exactly sure, answered Bobby, but I better think of something fast. He tightened up the straps on the pack and took a step toward the flume. I'm no big hero, he then said. I'm going to try to save Uncle Press and then get the hell out of there. I'd just as soon not stick around for the real fireworks. We'll be waiting for you, said Mark. Everyone looked at each other, not entirely sure of what to say. It was time for Bobby to go. There's nothing I can say to thank you guys for doing this and for hanging on to my journals, Bobby said. Just keep them coming, dude, said Mark with a smile. Bobby smiled, and then the three once again joined in a group hug. I'll write as soon as I can, said Bobby, and pulled away. Everyone was holding back tears. Bobby had turned to the flume when Courtney asked, Is Laura really as gorgeous as all that? Bobby winced, busted. You weren't supposed to see that, he said sheepishly. She's not my type. No? Said Courtney with a sly smile. I think she and I have something in common. We can both kick your ass. Bobby laughed at that. Of course she was right. Get home safe, she added. Soon as I can, was his reply. Mark gave him a wave, and Bobby turned back to the flume. He stepped in, took a breath, and said, Denderon! Instantly, the flume reactivated. The walls started to shimmer. The musical notes grew loud and bright, blasted out from somewhere far inside. Bobby turned back to them and gave a quick wave. Later, he said. Then in a flash, Bobby was gone. The light and the music trailed away inside the tunnel, transporting Bobby to his far-off destination. Soon all was quiet once again. The two stood there, staring into the dark, empty tunnel. There was nothing left to do now, except to start the long journey home. Uh-oh, Mark said. What? Asked Courtney nervously. Mark held out his hand, and they both saw that the gray stone in the ring was starting to glow. Mark quickly took it off and placed it down on the ground. They each took a step back and watched as the ring grew larger and light blasted out of the stone. The familiar musical tones were heard again as light built in intensely. There was a flash, and just as quickly as it started, it was over. The ring still lay on the ground. Next to it was another rolled up parchment. How could he have written so fast? Asked Courtney. Mark picked up the pages and started to unfurl them. Something tells me that time here and time there aren't relative, said Mark. Huh? English, please, demanded Courtney. I think Denderon might not only be another place, explained Mark. It might be in another time. It could be thousands of years ago or millions of years from now. The flumes not only travel through space, I'll bet they travel through time as well. Courtney didn't quite get this, but then again, she didn't get much of anything that was happening. Mark unfurled the pages, gave them a quick glance, then looked up at Courtney with a smile. I was right. It's from Bobby.